Greetings this Ash Wednesday, and welcome to our Lenten study on the authentic letters of Paul. The reason they're identified as authentic is because the 7 letters that we're going to look at are the 7 letters that scholars agree were written by Paul. The other 6 letters, 3 of that which are known as Deuteropauline, scholars can't agree whether Paul wrote them or not. And finally, the pastoral letters, that scholars are pretty well in agreement that Paul did not write those letters at all. One of the confusing things when you're looking at the Bible is that there's the first 5 books are identified as being written by Moses, and then the Psalms are being written by David, and the Gospels are being written by the people they're named after, and Paul wrote the majority of the letters in the Christian scriptures. And the thing is, a lot of that is just not true. We have no idea who wrote the majority of the Psalms. There's no authorship that anybody can identify with the first 5 books of the Bible, and none of the names on the Gospels were the actual writers of the Gospels. We don't know. The only one that we can even connect with any human being is actually the letters of Paul. And the really cool thing about the letters of Paul is that they were written within the first couple of decades after Jesus' death. So these are the first Christians, the first questions they had long before the Gospels were even written. These people were trying to figure out what our faith was. And the letters we're looking at particularly are First Thessalonians and Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and Romans. Romans itself is unique in that group because Romans is the only letter Paul wrote to a community that he didn't start. All the rest he had connections with prior to that. The letter to the Romans, and we'll get into this on week 5 when we start looking at it, the letter to the Romans was addressed to people who he wanted to help support a trip to Spain. And it's also one of the earliest places that the church looked for theology. Between the letter of Romans and the Gospel of John, the majority of Christian theology comes out of those 2 books in the Christian history, Christian scriptures. So Paul is important, not only as the eyewitness to the early church and the communicator therein, but also as someone who was able to put language to belief. And we owe him quite a bit. Now, what do we know about Paul? There's actually not that much that we know about Paul. The majority of the narrative, the story around Paul, actually comes from the book of Acts. And Acts was written around the year 100 by the same writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke. That person is known as the historian of the church, but not history the way we do it in the 21st century. They didn't have the expectation of authenticating any of their information. So they're basically the storyteller, the keeper of the tradition of the first centuries. For the purposes of this study, we're only going to look at the letters, not the version of Paul that we find in Acts, because there is a discrepancy between the two. And some scholars have suggested that makes one or the other not accurate. But I think it's more important to say they're both telling stories from different perspectives. Paul is not very autobiographical in his letters at all. A few things here and there we get, but nothing great about who he is as a person, where he came from, anything like that. Whereas when Acts was written, 40 years after Paul died, the legend of Paul had decades to grow. So when the writer of Acts was starting to put things down, we have a fuller story of who Paul was. Maybe it's not completely accurate, but it's enough to show us this person who spent a good chunk of his life helping the earliest Christian communities grow. As I said, we're not going to look at the letter of Acts. It'll spill in a little bit, but we're just going to try to keep that away as much as possible. So what does Paul say in his letters? Very little. The best we can figure out is he probably was born somewhere around the year 5 in the Common Era. He was born in a city called Tarsus, which is in Asia Minor. today's Turkey. It's a town that has continued to have a rich history, depending on what era you were. In fact, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were said to have met in Tarsus. So it's got a lot of history. His history before Paul and since Paul. He was born to Hebrew parents who probably named him Saul, which is a very strong Hebrew name. Paul would have been the Roman version of that. So, being born in the year 5, all of this was under Roman territory, of course. So, Latin would have been a language that was familiar. Greek was more familiar. That's the majority of people spoke that language and wrote in that language. And Hebrew, because that was the language of his faith, and it was the language of him communicating. At some point, he had a conversion experience. Now, he doesn't write about the conversion experience, and anytime you think of the conversion of Paul, we're immediately thrown back to the picture that we get in the book of Acts. All Paul says about it, and this is in the first chapter of Galatians or the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, all he says is that he had this experience, that Jesus in resurrected form appeared to all of these people, and he was the last one that the resurrected Christ appeared to. And from there, whatever was going on, Paul went to Arabia. And we have no idea how long he stayed there. The year 14 is bandied around, but whether that's 14 years after this experience, if this experience happened 14 years after he was already tussling up with the Hebrew folk, we don't know. But in that process, in that time, before his conversion and after he came to Jerusalem, he was working intentionally to destroy the new followers of Christ, to out them to the authorities, to put a complete limit to what this was. One of the words Paul uses is the word zeal. Now, we have to kind of be really careful with that word, because in the time, in the first century, zeal had several meanings. One is this Hebrew purist who wanted to get rid of anything that did not conform to what they believed the tradition to look like. Mostly the purists followed the Pharisee understanding of things. So Jesus, remember, didn't come to start a new religion, but he did come to moderate and modify what the Hebrew tradition was, and try to get them to get back on track, as it were. And Paul was against that. So he could have been a zeal, lowercase z, or he could have been a zealot, an uppercase z. Historians are not really sure if zealots as a group existed, if they were just kind of haphazard and did things similar, so they were kind of grouped together. But there, at the time of, in the first century, there was a number of sects in the Hebrew tradition: the Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, people of the way, the Jesus followers, and potentially the Zealots. So was Paul a part of that, or was he just an ad hoc, zealous person? We're not really sure how to read that word. He doesn't identify anything more than he had zeal to destroy the Jesus movement. And then after his conversion, he did a complete 180, and he started to missionize and be an apostle. So when that change happened, when that conversion happened, he was on his way to Arabia. So he kept going to Arabia. From Arabia, he eventually goes towards Damascus. So the conversion did not happen on the road to Damascus. But road to Damascus was something Paul traveled at some point after the conversion. And then Paul returned primarily to Turkey and Greece. Asia Minor was his home. He understood the culture. He understood the people. And he saw his mission to these people who were not Hebrew, so that everybody could be part of this new way of doing life, of this following of Jesus' message. And he spent his time going from community to community to encourage them, to teach them, to let them understand this new gospel, this new mission. when Paul talks about the scriptures, he's not talking about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John that we have, because they're not written yet. None of the stuff we have in the New Testament is written yet. So when he refers to scriptures, he's talking about the Hebrew scriptures. Because Paul himself, much like Peter and Jesus and all that gang, situated the emerging Christian community within the Hebrew tradition. It was not something separate, it was within, but it was an adaptation that allowed for things like uncircumcised people being fully accepted, which for the God-fearers, that wasn't happening. Here with the Christ followers, you could still follow much of your cultural expectations as a Gentile without having to follow the purity laws and the circumcision expectation that the Hebrews expected. So there was a way for the God-fearers to kind of get what they wanted and avoid what they didn't want. Paul became an advocate for that. We don't know how strong an advocate, but as we go through the letters, we're going to see a little bit more about what Paul had to say on that matter. Paul went to Ephesus and Corinthians and Philippia and all sorts of places, encouraging them and showing them how they should live. Now, all of the letters we have, save Romans, are Paul's response to problems that are going on in those communities. So we have to kind of look through Paul's letters and try to figure out what those issues were going on at the time in whatever community it was. And just to add last year's Lenten study into the mix, remember when we talked about John, who had written Revelation, John of Patmos? He disagreed with Paul. So wherever Paul was, John came in and he told the people, no, you're doing it right. You're supposed to do it this way. So there's a bit of tension between John of Patmos and Paul as well. It doesn't really get expanded upon a whole lot because, again, by the time John of Patmos is writing, Paul is dead, but his communities are still there and they're still following his ways, and that tension exists because the Christian church did not have solid structure, solid belief, solid scripture in the first century. So they were really struggling to individually figure out how they were supposed to function. And Paul's letters kind of help that, because as much as Paul says in his letters that he is a quiet person, he doesn't like to speak out, there was enough ego in the guy that he made multiple copies of his letters, spread them around enough that history was able to record some of them, and they now are part of our scripture. So he obviously was not that shy, and he tries to kind of reinforce how insignificant he is in a couple of ways. One is just saying in Romans 11, he talks about how he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Well, if you know anything about the tribes of the ancient Hebrew peoples, Benjamin is the smallest and youngest, the most insignificant in many ways, beloved, but not powerful. And at some point, the tribe of Judea absorbs the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul probably is not genealogically part of the tribe at this point in time. I don't think there's any way to authenticate anything in what tribe anyone is from. It's all legend and tradition at this point in time. But he identifies himself with the smallest and most insignificant. And that is a theme that Paul carries through. So he sees himself as the least worthy and keeps pushing that image of himself out, even as he acts as an authority. So there's a little bit of do as I say, not as I do kind of bit in Paul. And that carries over into how he relates to women. I remember when I was a teenager, I didn't want to have anything to do with the letters of Paul because in my mind, he was that guy who told women to be quiet. That has done a lot of damage to Paul's reputation. And it's taken some really, really solid feminist scholarship to get us beyond that. Paul was a product of his generation. There's no way he could avoid being part of the patriarchy. And as a Roman citizen, which he would have been living in Turkey in Asia Minor, he had a level of authority and respect, just of personhood, that a woman who was a Hebrew would not have had. So he had a freedom of movement and a freedom of money and a freedom of prestige that he took advantage of. He banked on it. He used that as his stock in trade. But if you look at his letters, it talks about all the women who helped him, who he's so grateful for. And in Romans 16, if you want to read ahead, there's a whole list of women who have titles. And this is something else that a lot of people who want to dismiss women in leadership in the church want to just say, oh, well, that's not really Paul's style. That's not part of his letters. We'll just dismiss it out of hand. Again, they're letting tradition dictate history. I'm a historian. Tradition is great and all, but it's not history. It's tradition. Historically speaking, we know through Paul that the earliest church had women who were deacons, women who were apostles, women who were teachers, women who were bishops eventually. We had a lot of learned women who were very active in the formation of the earliest church. And this was at a time when all of the words like bishop and deacon were adjectives, descriptors. They weren't titles. They would eventually become titles, but they hadn't been by the earliest church. And women did all of these jobs. That means women baptized. Women presided over Eucharist. Women were the pastoral care people. Women took care of the money. Women were just as active. In fact, one of the great ironies of feminist scholars studying Paul is we now know more about the women in the first century than the men, because the men haven't taken the time to explore other men. They've just spent most of their time denying women, which Paul shows us is kind of a waste of time. So as we go into Paul, we're going to be looking also at the women in the early church. We're going to dissect that whole be silent in church bit and what that could possibly mean. Spoiler alert, it does not mean women cannot speak. It means many other things, but not that. So Paul himself, being the complicated one he was, brings us a world view that we can't get anywhere else. So as we progress, I want you to keep all of this in mind, that he is not from Jerusalem. He is spiritually Hebrew, probably ethnically Hebrew, raised in a cosmopolitan world. So he understands people who are not spiritually like him, but who might be physically or economically like him. He has a mission that he feels and totally believes that Christ gave him. Whether there was an experience of him being chastised, like we see in the Road to Damascus story in the book of Acts, we'll never know. But it wasn't important enough for Paul to talk about it. He recognizes that he was on one path. Through conversion, he became now on another. And he spent the rest of his life trying to build and support and encourage the earliest Christians that we know about. So I invite you next week to join me. We're going to be looking at 1 Thessalonians and Galatians next week. Romans will be the last week that we look at. Third week, we're going to look at the 2 letters to the Corinthians. That's where we're going to get into that whole bit about women being silent. The 4th week will be Philemon and Philippians. And with Romans, we'll wrap up where Paul wanted to go and probably why he couldn't. How the Roman authorities at the time, were pretty fed up with Paul, and also how the fighting between the Hebrews and the Christ followers, the Hebrew Christ followers and the Gentile Christ followers, none of these people just automatically got along. So some of those tensions we raised. And always remember that we are reading the response to a problem. We're not reading about the problem itself. See you next week.